Hi everyone, welcome to the people coming in. Hi, welcome. This is lovely, it's filling up nicely. Welcome, welcome. We'll just give it a minute or so for people to come in before we get started. Hi everyone. Oh, I can see some nice familiar names from the project here. Okay, I think we will get started. So hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is working with the Media 101, driving coverage of ocean issues. My name's Natalie Hart, and I'm head of the Advancing Strategic Ocean Communication project here at Comms Inc. So that's a project that's led by Communications Inc. in partnership with the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. I can see a lot of familiar names here, but for those of you who are joining us the first time today and who are new to the project, our objectives are to advance the practice of strategic communications in the ocean sector, to make evidence and tools more accessible to all ocean communicators, and to galvanise greater investment in ocean comms. You can find out more by visiting the Comms Inc. website, or you can also sign up to the newsletter that my colleague Natalie here will drop a link to in the chat. The webinar today will be recorded, so we'll also make the recording available to you via the project website. So, the theme of the conversation today is driving coverage of ocean issues. I don't want to cause more alarm than necessary to everyone on the call, but we are now less than a month out from the UN Ocean Conference in Nice, which I imagine a lot of people will be participating in either remotely or in person. So in June, we'll have both the UNOC and World Ocean Day in 1 week, which are two key moments for media engagement. And from our work at Communications Inc. and as part of the Comms project, we already know from our community of practice that a lot of you out there are already very busy pitching stories and trying to drive ocean coverage. A lot of people working in this space recognise that there's a need for more ocean stories to help create the public will for systemic change. But we also know it's not always easy to get coverage and that not all types of coverage are created equally. So I'm really happy today to be joined by a very experienced panel of journalists and media professionals. So I have got Jenn Thornhill Verma joining us today. Jenn is from the Pulitzer Centre Ocean Reporting Fellow. So she's a Canadian freelance journalist and she covers fisheries, oceans and climate change. Welcome, Jenn. We also have here James Fahn, who is a journalist himself and also the executive director of the Earth Journalism Network, which supports over 4,000 journalists across the world to report on environmental issues. Welcome, James. And finally, last but not least, we have a friend of the project, David Akana, who's Director of Programmes at Mongabay Africa. And some of you may recognise him from being on the advisory board of the Advancing Strategic Ocean Communications project. So thank you all for joining us today. We had a quick chat before the webinar started, and just to all of our attendees, I want to say that I really encourage David, James and Jenn to be kind of as open and honest as possible today in the challenges that face journalists and in what NGOs can better do to help collaborate with them. So I hope it's going to be a really rich discussion. For everyone attending, you'll see that the chat is disabled, but the question and answer function is enabled. So please do submit questions as we go along, and I'll make sure that I leave plenty of time at the end of our discussion to address your questions directly. So I think we're going to start off with a bit of a scene setter question that's really about the appetite for stories about the ocean amongst editors and audiences. So we often hear that ocean issues are underreported. So we know, for example, that the Pulitzer Making Waves report that came out recently stated the need for more consistent and in-depth reporting of ocean issues. But is that because of a lack of public interest? Is it a lack of editorial interest? Or is it more about how these stories are pitched and told? So to our panelists, from your experience, are editors in general open to covering ocean issues when the story is strong? Um, do audiences respond to them once they're out there? And we'd just like to get your kind of general views on what the appetite is like. Um, Jen, can I come to you first on this one, please?
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for organizing this webinar. It's going to be, I hope, as helpful for me as it is participants. And I should say that I'm answering this question from the perspective of a freelance reporter who almost exclusively pitches ocean-related stories, be it about fisheries or climate change, and also in a country where Canada has the longest coastline on the planet, bridging the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, and the Arctic. And even then, I will say, I feel like a lot of the coverage is still considered feature style reporting. I'm fortunate this year I'm working as part of the Ocean Reporting Network with the Globe and Mail. And so the coverage that I am doing has seen 2 full print pages, online exclusives with additional content, podcast content, newsletter, and so forth. So I will say the effort is there. But for me, what I have found, my emphasis is very squarely ocean coverage, climate change, but I think it's because, to me, ocean coverage is environmental coverage. It is climate change solution stories. Increasingly, it's Indigenous reconciliation stories. In Canada, we talk about restoration of Indigenous sovereignty in colonialized lands to Indigenous communities. The same is happening in oceans coverage. So fish back or waterway back stories. And ultimately, I think they're really human stories. So, somebody doing something for a reason, for the ocean and the people and communities who depend on it. And I think for me, when I'm pitching, I'm really trying to emphasize new data, evidence, but never at the expense of great narrative. I think at the heart of it, it has to be about people who are impacted and addressing changes in their ocean environment, marine environment. And then I'll just say, don't forget, like we're talking about ocean coverage, but I think it always is about coming back to the imperatives and elements of journalism. We're holding authorities to account, we're verifying claims, we're asking if governments have committed to doing something, are they doing it? And if they are, is it delivering what they thought it would? So I think, there are some premises that are cross-cutting no matter what the coverage. But I would like to see more ocean coverage span the front page, and less so be relegated to feature news.
Thank you, Jen. James or David, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I can say a few words. Thank you again also for having us and really enjoy this topic. Obviously a demand for ocean coverage from editors that varies a great deal based on the personal preferences of editors often, but also I'd say on the audience and even the audience's physical location, how close they are living to the ocean. So obviously coastal communities tend to be more interested in ocean stories than those living far inland. I guess that's obvious, but and I think uh I think there has been more interest certainly in recent years. We've seen it grow. There's certainly more than there used to be. There's been a lot of attention paid to topics like ocean plastics and just recently, of course, in the news a lot about seabed mining, which has always been a kind of quiet topic that experts know about and discuss, but now I think it's obviously hit the news. And it also depends kind of on how stories are framed and to what extent, they, actually help the audience to understand their dependence on the ocean, not certainly for things like seafood and recreation and shipping but for other things that may not be so obvious. So I'm sure we'll be talking about that more. But those are my thoughts.
I might just want to add a few things. You could use whatever Jen and James have mentioned, to sort of do a quick tip sheet with respect to, what you should not leave out if you're going to pitch an ocean story. But just to say that, I'm not going to repeat every single thing they've said because I think they're all relevant, whether that be, let the story have data, let it be people-centric, let there be some evidence, the framing matters, the indigenous component to it, which is the IPLC, et cetera, et cetera. All of those different things are important. At Mongabay, we do have an oceans desk, which simply means that it's a key priority for us. That's at global, but even in Mongabay Africa, it's a central theme that we cover consistently. And when we go out to look for stories, what's clear to us is that it has to have the people dimension, the community dimension, because we have to absolutely link whatever we may be covering to the community and how it affects them. Of course, again, I'm not going to be repeating the fact that the relationship between oceans and climate is pretty close. And so, conceiving and pitching, that relationship, I think, has room to, perhaps maybe be of interest to journalists. But again, if you flip it around and then you look at how maybe communicators or maybe NGOs have actually engaged media, you'd have to say maybe there's more work to be done, isn't it? Because oftentimes it's just a press release with whatever you might have found that you think would be of interest to journalists, and then you send it out and you push that out. And oftentimes I don't even remember the last time I've used a press release to be able to do it. That we've used the press release in the newsroom to make a news coverage determination. And perhaps that speaks to, whether or not those press releases and how they're conceived and how they reach journalists. There's plenty of work to be done at that level, right? So, yeah, maybe those are just a few other things to add to what Jane and James have mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you. There was so much interesting stuff in there. Just kind of to start where David left off, like rethinking the way we write press releases, is a pretty strong kind of conversation that I think we could be having more in the community of practice. The other thing that I just wanted to pick up on from that last comment that I thought was interesting, was David, you commented on like not wanting to repeat the fact that like there's this really close ocean climate link, and it's funny how like we have conversations among ourselves where we almost take that link for granted, but actually we don't necessarily see it like translating into public audience perceptions. Like we don't actually necessarily see a general public who are aware of or like grasp that link. So even though for us it's a very natural thing that we can almost kind of gloss over at some point, getting that into stories, and getting editors on board with that being a kind of route into ocean coverage is an important one. So we talked about some kind of key things that make a good ocean story, right? So like having new data in it, making it people centric, having a really strong narrative. And so the next question, I guess I want to sort of like think about what that means in logistical terms. What challenges do journalists face when reporting on ocean issues, and how can NGOs support them? So we know that in some cases, reporting on ocean issues can be quite uniquely difficult, like logistically, in terms of like access to different parts of the ocean, to different coastal communities, and also just like the complexity of the data and the science, transparency of data, what's actually out there. So I guess like it would be interesting to know from your perspective, what are the main challenges you face, and how do you think that the NGO community and ocean advocates in general could better support you or kind of collaborate and fill those gaps? James, should we go to you first on this one?
Thanks, Natalie. So yeah, access is certainly by far the hardest issue because, and again, for obvious reasons, it's hard to get out on the ocean. It's even harder to get under the ocean where things are happening. So, we as journalists, I've spent a lot of time in fish markets and talking to fishermen and fisherwomen and market sellers and so on, trying to get information. And I think that's really the key, it can be challenging, not just to get out on the ocean and report, but also to get access to the people who have information on the ocean, because they tend to be either, um, government officials who can be reluctant to talk, or business, interests, fishing interests, similarly reluctant to talk. And I think the uh, other people who are often more open are the scientists, of course, and that's another great resource for people looking for information. I think the key thing is to find your allies, basically find the people who have the information and are willing to be open about it for whatever reason. Maybe it's a company that doesn't like what its competitors are doing out on the ocean. You'd be surprised how much information you can get from them. Sometimes it's anonymous, or other stakeholders who I think are often not uh, access enough are the military, basically the Navy. Navy has tons of information. Of course, a lot of that is going to be considered classified, but especially when it comes to issues like biodiversity, or they do have information, and maybe they're willing to share it. So I think we need to get a bit creative in finding ways to get that information, since it can be difficult to access.
Thanks, David.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Uh, One of the shortcomings we've seen in our reporting in the last couple of years is that, oftentimes the voices and the experts that we use in most of our stories are not representative of the global community or the different areas in which we work. And what we're trying, more and more and pushing ourselves to do is to actually, ensure that we are speaking to people, local communities. We're speaking to indigenous people who are affected by, the poor ocean health or whatever. And, I have to say that it's not easy to have access to these different individuals. And so for maybe anybody working in the ocean space, if you can provide us those different experts, and I really caveat experts here, and don't necessarily mean that, maybe, Harvard educated, environmentalist who knows the ocean. No, not necessarily. It's also somebody who lives in that community, whether that's on the south coast of Africa, in the Southeast Asia, or somewhere in around the Atlantic Ocean in I don't know, in Argentina. That indigenous knowledge, who has that indigenous knowledge. And so if we can get people like that, we want to elevate those voices, because that allows us to have a complete story and a more nuanced story. And I have to say that it's not easy, because for the most part, the bias that we're seeing in our reporting is because for the most part, the experts that we're using are primarily, I'd say we want to basically have a more representative view of society in the stories that we use. So that's going to be helpful if we can get NGOs to provide us that access, which is something that we don't get oftentimes. I think that's really something that's important to us, if I may just add that. Because keep in mind, it's hard to translate, the jargon that's commonly understood within the UN system. So if you took, for instance, blue economy, that may even be less controversial, right? It's basically all of the marine space, right? Maybe. But if you are in a region like, Swahili, East Africa, how do you translate blue economy into some local language which is understood by the people? And so if the overall intention here is to ensure that we're producing enough information and news in ways that gains traction and leads to the kind of systemic change, it would mean that we have to bring everybody on board. And is that happening at the scale at which we think it should happen for that systemic change to happen? I don't think so, right? So there's plenty of work to be done in that area. And so NGOs can be very helpful to get us to those local communities, and then we can elevate those voices, and this can also make sense to them. That may just be one other point that I can add in addition to what James said with respect to access. Yeah.
I'll build off of that, Natalie, and just say, I think evidence, good solid evidence science should be for everyone, but a lot of it lives behind paywalls. A lot of it is inaccessible. And I will say, I think a lot of my reporting is premised on, well, what does the best evidence say? But this is where I think NGOs are particularly helpful because yes, the scientists, and thank goodness for scientists who are quite adept at explaining in everyday terms, what it means, what it doesn't mean, the limitations, also what a new study means in the context of a body of literature that exists. But I will say this is where NGOs, I think, really thrive as evidence intermediaries and segueing a new study that comes out and making sure that, we're not turning that into hyperbole and that we're thinking about it in the context of the research that exists, but also what people are willing to do about a particular topic. The other issue that I think people really struggle with, and both James and David had mentioned this, is access. And, I refuse to do a story about ocean coverage that doesn't include people wearing boots in boats and harbors where the story happens. That can be scientists, that can be fishermen, that could be community members, plant workers, coastal communities, indigenous communities. But, in the same way that I think these stories need to be premised on great evidence, they also need to be premised on how is this consequential for the communities who are affected. And I'll just say, a case example in my own right. I mean, pandemic times when we weren't able to travel, I covered a story about sea ice weakening in northern Labrador in an Inuit region called Nunatsiavut. I wasn't able to get there on the ground. Years later, we did an update to that. We had time in the field. We did pre-reporting, post-reporting. We had a data sharing agreement with the local Indigenous community. The difference between those stories is leaps and bounds because we were there. You cannot sense the things in your reporting if you can't physically be there on the ground. In a place as large as Canada, in the world, in the global ocean, these are places that are incredibly difficult to get to. So I'm not saying, take me out in the middle of the ocean, although I'd love that as we talk about High Seas Treaty. At the same time, put me in rooms with people who do spend their time in the middle of the ocean, in places that are hard to reach, and to James' point, at the bottom of the ocean too. I mean, these are the types of things that I need to be able to understand and sense to report on.
And I just feel like adding one more point, if you don't mind, Natalie, which is the question of linking oceans to politics, to economics, to culture, which is oftentimes a framing issue. And I think one of the reasons why we really have not made progress with respect to environmental coverage, be it biodiversity, oceans, pollution, land degradation, or whatever, is that it is too environmental. And that's very limiting, isn't it? So I think it's really critical that we find ways to link these different issues to politics, because that's the only way in which you're going to go out of this. I don't know how many billion people believe in this cause. Because, I mean, better than I, of course, beyond disinformation, there's also the fact that many people on the right side of the political spectrum in most global North countries don't even believe in a lot of what we're doing right now, right? Isn't it? So if you want to stand a chance of ensuring that they at least listen to you, read you, or even find maybe relevance in what you're doing, you've got to be more creative. And I think that's what we're not doing at this point. And I think that's something that I'm really interested in seeing how we bring those connections as we move forward to actually broaden our appeal in terms of whatever we may be doing in this space.
Yeah, thanks all of you. It's interesting that the word creativity has come up a couple of times there, both in terms of like how we access kind of unconverted audiences or newer audiences, and then also with James talking about more creative and kind of finding out who our allies are. I guess I just want to ask a follow-up question to the comments you all made, because it sounded like a lot of what we were talking about was relationship building. So kind of finding stories from people on the ground, finding NGOs who can kind of be the bridge with the new science. And I guess like on a very like practical or from a very practical standpoint, everyone's busy, right? Like journalists are busy, people have deadlines, NGOs are busy. Do you have preferred ways of like accessing this information? Like, is it when you kind of think about building these relationships, is it like going to conferences? Is it NGOs running more press briefings to get the right people in front of you? Like, is there something that you'd like more of from NGOs to get the right people and stories in data in front of you? David, I can see you're ready to go on that one.
Well, great. No, thanks. Many people in the newsroom and in the newsroom in which I am are very skeptical of press releases. They're very skeptical of meetings. They don't, you know, and I understand why, because I think that's the way their mind frames are structured. So when something is being pushed onto them, they have questions. And so they would like to build those relationships in communities with experts and find data sources that they trust and they can use those. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that if there's anyone working here in communication shop in an NGO that you don't stand a chance in our newsroom, not far from that. But I think it's also something that you cultivate over time to gain trust. And then you know pretty well that, trust can be very helpful in terms of, getting a lot of these things done. So yes, bottom line is that, no one reporter has any specific ways in which they engage. And in the newsroom in which I am, I do know that many people are very skeptical of press releases, and I mean, I understand why, because I think there's an agenda behind it. But press briefings, they help, because I also have to say that one of the reasons why people might not necessarily want to use some of this information oftentimes is because they think it's being dumbed down onto them. And when you do not have knowledge of a specific thing, the natural instinct is to reject, right? And so I think, organizing sessions that allows journalists to be able to listen, learn, can be very helpful with respect to taking on that bid over time. So I would encourage that. I think it helps. I'm not in any way suggesting that it does not, but just be mindful of the mindset of the reporters that you're dealing with, and ensure that you're transparently discussing everything. And actually, you are even more forthcoming than you may want to be, because that way it allows them to be able to gain trust. I'll stop there.
If I
Thanks,
may add,
David.
yes, if I may add, I just want to make a strong pitch for conferences. I know that's a time tested method, but it's really, the Earth Journalism Network, um, our most popular activity, and we do a lot of training, capacity building, and directly support story through grant making and so on. But our most popular activity is our fellowship programs that bring journalists to conference. In fact, I first met David because we brought him as a journalist. I think it was the Rio Plus 20 conference back in 2012, and we got to meet. But the point here I want to make is uh, you can do so much more in person at a conference than you can at a webinar. I know that may seem obvious, but I mean, first of all, you meet people that you had no idea existed, didn't know about, and you make great contacts with them. Secondly, it's not just attending the speeches and talks or poster sessions or whatever. It's going up after the talks, in between talks, talking to them over lunch, over a drink, or whatever it is. That's when you really get your best information as a journalist. And that's just hard to do on a virtual, briefing, as much as helpful as they are, and we do a lot of virtual we don't do many webinars anymore. We do more virtual workshops, but we understand the value of them, especially it being cost effective. But there's still the access that you get at a conference. And we definitely find many more stories are produced when journalists go to a conference than if they, attend a webinar. So you're getting more capacity building, more content production out of conference. And yeah, it's more expensive, but the conferences are perfect for journalists access. So if you are organizing a conference as an NGO, or if you know of an important conference, you should find a way to bring journalists there one way or another, because that I think can really help you get your message out.
Yeah, I wanna tag onto that and say, yes, please. I was really fortunate that at the beginning of my Pulitzer Fellowship covering US and Canada protections of North Atlantic right whales, that conveniently all of the researchers convene in fall at the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium meeting. And I was able to be there as a media person and, take in all of the sessions, get the handouts after, but it's that in between break time that was so invaluable, and the FaceTime, so that when I'm then calling or emailing, it's not a cold call or email. So that was absolutely incredible. I don't know that it's always going to line up like that, but phenomenal opportunity. I will say, don't throw away the press release, but I agree with David that press releases have not prompted me to write stories, but I do love finding them where I expect them to be in a pinch. So, and absolutely, I think, all journalists need to approach any of these releases from the perspective of, what angle are you trying to bring to this, or what is it that, you're advocating for? So you have to come to any of your reporting with a healthy dose of skepticism. And then I'll just say it's relationship building. I mean, I'm going to ask sources questions that don't go to print. You're going to send me stuff that I don't get back to you on. That's relationship building. And I think, I really appreciate when an NGO, contacts me and says, hey, are you covering this? We're working on this now. Are you covering it? Yes, no. If yes, great. Email to follow. Or the just-in-time briefings that can happen at these COP events, these UN meetings, before in advance of pressers. So, that kind of just-in-time, and also meeting, I think, journalists where they are. Are you covering this? Great. Here's some info.
Thank you. I mean, I'm definitely hearing here sort of it's about playing the long game with relationships, right? I just a kind of a follow-up thought or question on the conference point. So I know from an NGO perspective, just from the emails flying around Comms Inc. at the moment, that like everyone is always desperate to know what media is going to be at a conference. And so at the moment we're getting loads of emails that's like, who's going to be there? Who's going to be there? Like, how do we find out? And I suppose, do you have any advice for NGOs who are looking to connect with media at conferences in terms of like, do we sort of just have to hope that we run into you for these sidebar meetings, or are there any kind of more formal ways to figure out who's going to be there? How would you feel about getting an email from an NGO beforehand saying, look, hey, we're going to be at this, like, do you have time for a coffee? Do you have any thoughts around that?
I mean, personally, I appreciate that, because look, if I'm going to be at Biodiversity Summit or the UN Ocean Conference, or and you're working on a particular issue, there's no harm in, I think, sharing that you're working on that, and do our interests meet, particularly if I'm reporting for a national publication in Canada. This is consequential in that particular case, all the better. So I would say yes. I mean, that's how this starts, in the same way that, I make outreach trying to find the right perspective, doesn't always land, but that person can snowball effect tell me who I ought to speak to instead. So yeah, I think that's natural, makes absolute sense. And I certainly appreciate it, particularly, I think, as James was saying, in the lead up to events and at events. I mean, there's such a buzz and activity. This is the time to try to meet the right people and make those connections.
Yeah, and at EGN, we advertise the journalists we're bringing to a conference. So next month, we'll be bringing 8 to 10 journalist fellows from around the world to the UN Ocean Conference in France. And we have our newsletter, which just went out, lists the journalists who will be there. So it's easy to find out, or you can just ask us, of course. But we're always, before going to conference, reaching out not just to NGOs, but to all kinds of stakeholders to see who will be there and who we can meet with.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you a question now just about UNOC in particular, because we've got that coming up. So we already know that like lots of people are pitching stories for the UN Ocean Conference already. We know it's going to be World Ocean Day that same week, which is always sort of very noisy space in terms of people trying to get ocean coverage. And I wondered, from your points of view, is there anything you're on the lookout for? Do you have sort of predictions on what you think is likely to gain traction in terms of story from UNOC Week? And just whether you have any advice on how to stand out from the crowd, kind of in that very noisy environment. David.
I'm not sure I do have, any magic bullet with respect to that. This is where creativity comes in. There's a lot of noise out there. We all know that. And the question for me, as yeah, I think it is to all of you, it's, how do you stand out in this crowded space, whether that be on social media or anywhere else? So it's a challenging time. We all know that, right? And the question is, in addition to all the things that maybe in the news, whether that be politics, elections, trade, or whatever, how do you sprinkle, any ocean issue there and really gain traction? I'm not sure, but we're going to try to pretend that we know the answer and that we can try to do that and get maybe that big headline in some of, in international media, a week before during the event itself. But I do think that, maybe for us, obviously, because Jenn did mention this, we are very future oriented. It simply means that oftentimes we can just sit there and let, the UN Ocean Conference go by without necessarily saying anything. I will just be fine because our audience is not expecting us to, maybe report on the state of the negotiations, where we are, and all of that kind of thing. That's maybe for others to do. This is Mongabay anyways, just keep that in mind. Others may be interested. Those who are more newsy, they may be interested in all of that. But we intend to have people there. And so the likelihood is that they're going to obviously be focusing on the state of the negotiation, the different perspectives, the different delegations, what they're saying, and all of that kind of thing. So we're going to have that. But if the question here is for the NGOs who are involved and are participating and want to at least, be able to put the spotlight on some of the things that they're doing, it's, cultivating those relationships with, based out of what they may have as a media list, based on their priority geographies and all of that kind of thing, and maybe check EGN as who is coming in from Latin America, who is coming in from Africa, and engage with them directly. This has worked for me in the past, right? I've done most of the climate meetings, thanks to James and the team. My first was back in 2005. And what I've noticed is that when people reach out directly to me and say, David, we work in the Congo Basin. We do have something of interest. Would you want to, cover it? And yes, usually I like that because, again, oftentimes I'm also in search of something to report about. And if it's something of interest, then I go for it. So, those are, maybe some little tips that, they might, and I'm just speaking maybe mostly to the number of people who might be gathered here for this webinar. And maybe others who are going to listen after. But so that tends to work. Yeah, it tends to work for me. Yeah.
I can jump in. As I'm thinking about my own coverage, I'm thinking about the balance between something that's explainer style, because a lot of these conversations, although they're incredibly consequential for the global ocean, everyday people struggle to make sense of what it means, like the High Seas Treaty. So, I think in that kind of a case, it's my job to say, well, what did governments commit to doing? And, in Canada's case, it committed to signing and ratifying that treaty. We're not there yet. Now, we've had a very newsy year. We've got a new prime minister, and a few other things have happened. Some changes in our neighbors, but that's the kind of thing that I think, as a journalist, it's my responsibility to say, this is what our government has committed to doing. This is why, and this is to what end. So if we can't even get to the point of ratifying, what's fallen off the bandwagon here, and what else can we expect to fall off the bandwagon? The other thing that I've just observed, and I'm not an expert in, but I'm learning on my feet, is issues that even you mentioned earlier, Pulitzer Center's Making Waves report, which is excellent. It does a great job of, I think, summarizing the ocean reporting landscape, gaps in that area. In that report, they said that emerging issues, deep sea mining, the blue economy, socioeconomic impacts of marine conservation policies, these are not emerging. These are on our shores. These are happening. Governments are making announcements. They want to sidestep being able to understand, what the ramifications and due diligence is here. So I think, also relaying the speed with which things seem to be happening or decisions seem to be being taken without a full appreciation of what does it mean and how is it going to impact coastal communities and island states. So, and then I'll just say the other thing too is because I'm working on a series now about North Atlantic right whales, I'm also thinking about, well, what's the species at risk, migratory marine story that also has legs elsewhere in the world. And so I think about things like, I know ocean noise is going to be an important conversation at this particular event. So, we're at a place of needing to better understand how ocean noise, disrupts marine ecosystems and migratory species. And so, what kinds of commitments and understanding are going to be shared at this particular venue that, again, at a time when Canada, the US, they have ocean noise strategies, are moving in that direction, that we'll be able to have great questions that we ask our own governments to hold them to account to make sure that, they are delivering on their commitments.
Great points by my colleagues. And certainly as they indicate, finding out where journalists are from, that's how you're going to know what are the key issues that they are interested in. In Jen's case, certainly around Canada, in David's case around the Congo Basin. And they made they've also listed a bunch of hot topics that I think will be widely discussed. There are other topics that come to mind. The 30 by 30 commitments. We're halfway to 2030, and I don't think we're very close to achieving targets. So I think that could be a really good angle for journalists and maybe NGOs to focus on. Other topics that I think get underreported are the connection between ocean and health. That's a really interesting topic. It's a difficult connection to make, but we know, for instance, that there are, algae blooms that release toxins like domoic acid, and that's certainly affecting marine life, and it's probably affecting humans too, just as one example. But there are a lot of ways the oceans affect our health, whether through the food or the atmosphere. And I think that's a kind of unexplored area that I would like to see more reporting on. And also the Mediterranean. We're going to be on the Med. There's been we've done a lot of increased coverage in recent years on the Mediterranean, and I think this will be a good opportunity to get information about that very important region. And yeah, we've had impacts resulting from that too. Our stories have led to Tunisia doing a cracking down on illegal trawling, to Libya um, banning dynamite fishing and so on. So, I mean, these stories can have real impact, and it's important to get them out and into the public. Thank you.
Thanks, James. It's always really great to hear of examples where there has been some kind of tangible change as a result, because I think that's what so many of us are working towards. And I think in the communication space in particular, it can be quite difficult to sort of demonstrate that impact, right? The kind of how you're contributing to an overall change, and it's always really nice to hear examples of that. The other thing that just struck me as you were all talking, that might sound like a bit of an obvious observation, is that I think sometimes as ocean advocates and NGOs, there's a lot of focus when we approach journalists on like what we want to say, like what our message is, what the story is that we want to tell. And it's really interesting hearing you all speak from a journalist perspective, where like the question is, how do you connect with your audience? So it's about like what kind of stories are your audiences interested in hearing, whether that's like a political story or a story that's geographically relevant to them. And so I think that's useful for the NGO community to hear, is like, okay, like how do we shape our message into a story that then resonates with that kind of audience, rather than just thinking about like what it is that we have a burning desire to say. I can see we've got a couple of questions in the chat now. I'm gonna go over to them just with some of our remaining time. So we've got a question at the top, which is, what is the alternative to press releases? David, I think you touched on that a bit, but do you want to just take that one? Thank you.
I don't know if there are any alternatives to press releases, right? But I think we've got to question ourselves with respect to the tools that we use to engage with the media. And that has to be something that we keep questioning as we move forward. Are we being effective? Is it yielding the kind of results that we desire? And if your answer is yes, then I guess you're going to continue in that direction. But the answer is no, then you're going to find different ways in which you're going to engage with. I just worry that at this point, 30, 40 years after the overall messaging around sustainability was out there, that we've not significantly made progress. People are not winning elections based on their climate agenda. It simply means that there's a problem with respect to how we're communicating. And so we've got to recognize that, broadly, this might have to do a lot more than just the press release issue, which is, I think, for anybody who believes in these issues, whether they be advocates or maybe us journalists who have as environmental issues a value to us, and maybe that's why we do it as much as we do this from a measured perspective, from an independent perspective. We've got to recognize that there's a lot more creativity that we have to use to be able to succeed. So maybe press releases and how you use them and double down on use of press releases would depend on where you are, who you're talking to, how you're engaging, what results you're getting, and then you're going to make a determination with respect to whether you find different ways in which you engage. I think if I was just maybe to provide one answer there, relationship building is critical. I've realized that that's one of the best ways in which you engage. If people trust in you, they start quoting you, they start using what you're sending out to them. But that is something that you build over time. You just cannot send me a mass messaging, doesn't work well. If I just sit there, well, as much as Jenn said, she likes to see them whenever she wants to see them. But again, mass messaging has huge weaknesses because you're not sure about whatever is coming your way, and so it's always better to build those relationships. I have to know this is James. I know him. I know his motives, and that kind of thing. It allows you to make progress than when you just maybe just send things without necessarily and hoping that somebody's going to pick them then. Yeah.
Thank you, David. I'm going to go to another question now. It's quite a long one, and I'm going to summarize. And so please forgive me if I'm not summarizing it accurately. But it's essentially saying that in the past, there has been sort of a level of sensationalism in reporting, and honesty and accuracy and integrity of data has rarely been challenged, whereas modern journalists are a lot more demanding of independent, verified information. And the question is this having a negative impact on publishers using some stories? Are you expected to be communications departments for NGOs with agendas? So I think this is really about like verifying information, so the kind of data that you're using and that process. So Jenn, would you like to comment on that one?
Yeah, and I'll say, Mike, thanks for putting that question in. Mike's a Newfoundlander, as I am, and lived during a time when news broadcast frequently pitted conservation-minded scientists against commercially motivated fishers, and created this kind of false balance, or both sidism. I mean, I think that in these complex issues can really misrepresent, and I think that tradition of the two opposing viewpoints. I think we're moving away from that, and we're having a much more sophisticated conversation. I think while it may seem fair on the one hand to present these alternative viewpoints, but it undermines the credibility of both what the evidence says, and also I think it confuses people. So I think Mike's questioning is coming from a place where we're really having to recalibrate, and think about trust. Like, who does the everyday person for whom decisions have been made, for example, in Ottawa, or capital city, that are consequential thousands of kilometers away on a coastline, decisions taken without the perspectives of people with the boots and boats and harbors where the story is happening. And how do we get back to a place of trust? And I think, in the same way you wouldn't dream in healthcare coverage of covering a healthcare story without thinking about you know, those who have the most experience with care, patients and families, community members. I really think we need reporting that starts with boots in the harbors and waterways and the wharves where this is happening. And so I think that's what you're, Mike, that's what I'm going to read into your comment, and to say that, you know, our job is a job of verification. No matter how great these relationships are built and how much I certainly rely on the evidence intermediaries that NGOs are, I have to continuously verify, validate, cross-reference, and also think about the premise of this reporting, which I think is to hold you know, authorities to account for the betterment of people, and in this case, coastal communities and ocean communities.
Thanks, Jen, and thank you, Michael, for the question. The next one we've got is, what do you recommend as the best course of action if information is misrepresented in a published article?
Call us on it. I sadly had a date. I in my last article, it's like you try your damnedest for this never to happen. It's the bane of your existence when it does. You hope it rarely happens. I got a date wrong in my last article. A scientist very nicely wrote me a note and said, by the way, I thought you'd like to know, buried 3 paragraphs down. And, you know, boom, that's what I zeroed in on. It's like the error you see on the page after the page has been bloody printed. Call us on it. We've got to, you know, this is what corrections are for. And as I said, ours is a job of verification. And so unfortunately, with as much effort as we try, that will happen. But hopefully it will happen fewer and farther between, or otherwise I might need another job. Yeah.
And you do
Thanks.
have a tool as well. Yeah, no, I just saying you do have a tool, which is the write or reply. So you can actually write to us and we're going to correct the whatever, you know, we might have misrepresented or got it wrong.
Thank you. The next one we've got here, how do we ensure that following films like Ocean, NGOs are communicating a strong call for action and using media relations to spread that message? Do any of you have thoughts on that? I mean, I feel like just from a personal perspective, I read that as more a question to the NGO community. So how can we, I'm assuming the film like Ocean is a reference to the new David Attenborough film. And so I think for me, that's like, how do we use these kind of big cultural moments as something to rally around, where the NGO community comes together. And that's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, actually, in terms of international collaboration of NGOs. So I know, like with this project, we have the communications community of practice, and we also have a network called the One Ocean Flotilla that's about 100 ocean-related organisations. And I think it's really key that when we have these cultural moments like that, that kind of raise the ocean up in the public consciousness, that we do have shared calls to action. And I think collaboration is the way to do that, because the thing about the ocean is there are lots of different issues going on at the same time, right? And so messaging and calls to action can get quite fragmented. But I very much agree that those are moments that we 100% need to capitalise on.
And I could just add something, if you don't mind, Natalie, that most media in developing countries are public service instruments, meaning that they don't necessarily, you know, demand money for every single thing. And so if you do have a campaign where you have celebrities, you know, cultural icons, they can run those in some media organizations. And I know there are many broadcasters in developing countries who run those kinds of adverts. And of course, it leads to the behavioral change that you're looking for, isn't it? So yes. I've seen that a lot of campaigns on pangolangs, you know, where you're using local soccer stars speaking up against, you know, that kind of trade, and then it works. So I would imagine that for media organizations, you know, like the ones you might find a lot in the global south funded by the state, they're basically, you know, there for the public good, and so they might obviously broadcast those kinds of, you know, videos, or maybe run those kinds of campaigns. Yeah.
Great, thanks, David. Oh, so go on, Jen.
I
I just
just
wanted to say that one of the things about the ocean film and David Attenborough's work, which I think is, I'm hoping that one experiment I see NGOs tap into is, we've been talking about storytelling about, somebody doing something for a reason, holding governments to account, and no doubt there's that in this film. I'm sure, because you can see now the dragger footage, the never before seen dragger footage making its rounds on social media. But there's also something in there about relaying a story about the ocean system. And I think people are fascinated with just understanding how the ocean works, the currents, the cold intermediate later, the seasonal sea ice, plankton bloom, algae bloom. So, people have an appetite, I think, for the ocean that they haven't yet before. There's also more information at our fingertips. And I think about after you've binged watched White Lotus and then you want to read all the spoilers or you want to go deeper down a particular path, I would love for NGOs to do that for something like this. I mean, that's a perfect opportunity to do so. So just to say, in the same way that, we're eager and interested and we want the entertainment, we also want really like infotainment and explainer, because, we're talking about parts of our world that many people will never have that close access to.
I would just add, at risk of stating the obvious, that when you approach journalists, whether it's about the ocean or other pitches, make it about a story and not an issue. Issues, of course, are what weaved into these stories, but you really want journalists want stories and they want some narrative. And so when you approach them, whether it's through a press release or preferably some more personal means, I mean, highlight the elements that make it a story, whether it's about a certain person, a dynamic scientist, or maybe it is an ocean mechanism that people aren't aware of. That can be a story too. But just, I think especially in the policy world, and maybe in the NGO world, the focus is a lot on issues, which of course are so important. But for us to make these stories attractive to audiences, it's got to become a story. And you can really help in help make transforming it into that.
And Natalie, I'm not sure how much time you still have, but the point is, for me as well, would be that, solution stories tend to gain a lot of traction. And I know we've not talked a lot about that because maybe, we had several other issues to talk about. But the bottom line here for me just simply being that, we are more inclined towards looking at stories that, have a solutions connotation to it. And so to James' point, if you showed me some individual anywhere in the world who is working with an oceans champion, that's somebody I'm willing to read and do a story about. The solutions that have worked, the innovations that have worked. That's more and more helpful. And that's also because there's a lot of literature out there that also states that when you have solutions-oriented stories, they gain more traction because people are actually turning off from news. People don't want to watch news anymore because the gloom and doom is pretty straight, it's clear. And that's why every single time you try solutions-oriented stories, there's a likelihood that you're going to get a lot more traction. So that would also help with the framing for those who are here.
Great, thanks. I think those were both really important points to end on. So solutions-focused stories, and also James, I mean, you say maybe it's stating the obvious, that it needs to be a story and on issue, but I would say that if it was that obvious, we're still doing it very wrong. So thank you for that reminder at the end. It's been honestly such a joy to speak to the three of you, so much expertise, and I hope everyone listening has found it really useful as well. I think boots on boats is my new favourite expression from Jenn. I'm going to be using that in terms of talking about access in the future, that we need to get more journalist boots on boats. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. I can see Natalie has put there in the chat, just as a reminder, if you haven't signed up for updates on this project already, please do. We'll be making this recording available, as I said, and you can also find the recording from our previous sessions. So thank you for joining us. And again, David, James, and Jenn, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise.